Welcome to Women Leading in Health. I'm Dr. Linda Edwards, and this is the podcast series that explores the skills and mindset required to lead in the world of health and medicine. Whether it will be an emphasis on teamwork, communication, or adaptability, I'll be finding out what makes these female leaders tick and how others can model their success. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Laura Sharpe, who until very recently was the Chief Exec of the GP Federation in City and Hackney, and has quite a long and illustrious career in the NHS since 1987. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
So I think having these conversations with people who are listening to them are saying, well, so how did people manage their career and how did they end up where they ended up? So could you give us a little insight into your career pathway and how you progressed?
I think quite often people imagine that careers are managed in a structured way. In reality, I don't think mine was very managed. I joined the NHS. People gave me opportunities. I took them. I wasn't entirely sure at the time why I was taking them, other than it was a new, interesting thing to do. And then there were probably maybe only 2 times in my career when I actually planned and applied for a job and thought, I really want this one. And I have conscious reasons as to why I want it. And the main one was getting to Hackney. I really wanted to get into City and Hackney, into what was then the primary care group, that then became the primary care trust, and then later the GP Confederation there. That was a very conscious decision to do that. But many of my others were people saying, why don't you, do the on-call rota for UCH A&E, even though it was nothing to do with my job. And I went, okay, I'll do that. And then that would lead you down another path. And I found that quite exciting. So it wasn't planned in a conscious way. Maybe the planning was that I just grabbed opportunities as they came.
It's really interesting. A number of people say that it's not a straight career ladder or pathway, really, is it? We tend to kind of move around and take opportunities and see where they go.
Yeah, and I would recommend that people do that. So I've been talking to a young person recently who's been offered an amazing opportunity in her job, not in the NHS. And I really had to talk her out of, well, I don't see why I should do that. They're not paying me anymore. It's extra work. And I said, just look at what they're offering you. It will open another million doors. So be careful before you have a gut reaction that says, no, I want to go home at 5 o'clock. Just think carefully about, what does this give me? What skill does this give me? What experience does this give me? And will it be exciting and interesting and new?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that kind of speaks to your leadership style. How would you describe your leadership style?
I hope inclusive, but not exclusively inclusive. I always am very keen to get the input of clinicians and people who are on the ground near to the patient and seeing the patient, who can say, this is what it's really like, and this is what's wrong, and this is how it needs to change, and this is why. I also have come to the decision that I'm very happy to do that for a while, but it has to turn into something. I do not want to be constantly having conversations with people about this is the problem, without at some point going, and what are we going to do about it, and what's the solution, and how are we going to do it, and who's going to do it, and when we're going to do it by, and getting on with some action. So I think it's got to be a mix of being quite fluid at the beginning, but then becoming much tighter about, right, we've explored now we're moving into the next phase. And as a leader, being clear when the right moment to do that is, to go from the all-inclusive, involving everybody, into, right, we're deciding now and we're going forward.
So how do you know when it is the right moment?
Gut, instinct. For me, I think I work a lot on instinct. Probably sometimes get that wrong and maybe go a bit early, possibly, and have to go back round the loop a little bit. But I see this is my personal view, of course it is, only talking to me, I see the NHS sometimes spending far too long on that. And I can see it napping off people, especially clinicians who've been around forever. And you'll see it in their faces sometimes. I told it again, and now you're asking me, and actually I want to see some change. So I guess it's a lot about the invisible signals people give as much as what they say. What's their body language? What words are they using that would lead you to say, okay, they're now waiting for the leader to say, let's do it, and I'm hearing that we should do this, this, and this. Let's get on. Sometimes the relief on people's faces when that actually happens, you think, gosh, this is a bit unusual.
But I guess it's probably based around your experience of having done this so often that your instinct is very strong in those areas.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think at the beginning of my leadership career, I didn't have the confidence to think, oh, that is what people expect me to do that. Mm-hmm. So I suspect at the beginning it was a bit slower, a bit more tentative. Mm-hmm. But you build that experience through your career.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say have been the standout defining moments in your career?
Mm-hmm. I'm very proud of having closed something, which people may not think is right. But when I was working in Hillingdon, there was something called the Mount Vernon Hospital A&E department. It wasn't really an A&E department. It was basically a one-man show, a one A&E consultant man, lovely man, running it 7 days a week. His phone was never switched off, except when he went to church on a Sunday. And that is not a sustainable model, and that is not a modern A&E department giving everything. It didn't have all the backup services behind it. It was effectively a minor injuries unit, and we were able to explain that through the things we wrote, the conversations we had. We had conversations for a year with everybody before we launched a consultation document. So we actually closed that department or changed its status, and with the full consent of local public opinion and the Community Health Council that existed there. And that told me, like everything in life, it's the trust, the relationships, and the conversations. So when you launch a document, you haven't talked to anybody beforehand. Of course, you're going to get a knee-jerk reaction and suspicion because you haven't built the trust. So I was really proud of that because we did something that was right, because it wasn't the right sort of service, and it changed minor injuries unit and continues to this day. And then I think I'm really proud of improving the services, the shockingly bad services that existed in City and Hackney when I arrived. I was amazed how underfunded the East End was back in the early 90s. And how much illness there was in the local population. You could see it walking down the street, the levels of mental ill health and physical disability that you came across. So, that's again a long journey through all those years. But, City and Hackney General Practice now is top in the quality scores.
Ah, that's amazing.
How can we for somewhere like that? Yeah, exactly. Call it top of the cloth.
Yeah.
And that's remarkable. That's utterly remarkable, and it's now normalised. That's the other thing. It wasn't a one-off. It's now what people do year in, year out. We have the best smoking quit rates in the country. People ask us how we do that. And I remember when I first got there, something dear to your heart, Linda, from your clinical past, that podiatry and chiropody service was on its knees. Everybody was moaning about it, and all the patient complaints were about the service. The Community Health Council said it was their top awful thing. I went to see the staff. They looked like they were on their knees. They looked worn down, terrified, just ready to give up. And instead of doing what are you going to do? What are you doing? Why is it better? Well, that was going to get us nowhere. We did lots of conversations, and talked to them about how hard it was for them, how to make the change. They'd got to the point where they didn't think change was possible, but it was, and we did it, and it became a highly performing, high quality service that started to then attract people to come and join it. So those are things I'm really proud of. And then I'm really proud of my role during COVID, supporting all the GP surgeries who didn't know what the heck they were supposed to do when they were supposed to do it, running the hot hub services for Hackney so that anybody with suspected COVID was seen. Remember in those early days when everybody was masked up and didn't know how serious this was and whether if you were in contact with someone, what that meant. So persuading doctors to actually run a 7-day-a-week, 12-hour-a-day service to see anybody suspected when the rest of the practices were just doing telephone. And then running the vaccination service for Hackney, which was incredible. I mean, I've never worked so hard in my life. But to be able to put a special clinic on for people with learning disabilities and a special clinic straight after Passover with all the rabbis in attendance so that the Orthodox Jewish community came, or a special sort of confidential, quiet, under the radar clinic for sex workers. That was very meaningful. Very meaningful.
Yeah, very powerful. So, I mean, it sounds to me like you've learned an awful lot along the way, but what would you say is your biggest learning of all of that?
As I say, explore the problem, explore the solutions, decide, don't let it drift. That feels to me like what leaders are supposed to do. And I always have in my head my Auntie Jo, who was just an ordinary lady in Stoke-on-Trent. She's dead now. She worked in a factory. And I used to think, well, she'd expect that that's what people do. That's what my job is. That's what I'm paid for, to get on with it. So that always is at the heart for me of what I do. And yeah, but to do that, I think the other job of a leader, another key lesson is that it's the leader's job to create the space for that to happen. Because you could spend your life, and there are leaders who do this, by just waiting for the powers that be to tell you things and then just trying to vaguely do them, or not even vaguely do them, just sort of talk about them. And that to be seen as delivering your role. I don't think that's delivering your role. I think your role as a leader is to manage the politics so that the real work, the right things, the things that need to be done in your local area that only you and the local people and local doctors and nurses know, get done. It's not just to wait for a top-down instruction. And in order to do that, I think you're supposed to speak plainly. I always imagine I'm speaking to my Auntie Jo. Be clear what's expected and then keep checking that it's happening. It's not that hard. Well, it is hard, but it isn't complicated. But I think it can be made very complicated if you're not careful. So I always try and bring it back to those sorts of things, those sorts of principles.
Auntie Jo would be totally surprised, I'm sure, if she knew what a big influence she
would. She would. Especially as she basically smoked and drank herself in her life. That was her life, drinking whiskey and smoking cigarettes. So I don't think health was right at the top of her agenda, but she taught me a lot.
Brilliant. So what was it that actually drew you to the health service in the first place?
Total accident. My first job, when I left university, all I knew with my best friend was that we were going to try and come to London for a year. That was in 1987. I was still in London. And so we both thought, right, let's try and get jobs. I knew I wanted to be in the public sector. It wasn't any more differentiated than that. So I applied for and was interviewed for 2 jobs on the same day. One in Redbridge Council as a housing officer and one in what was then North West Thames Regional Health Authority in Paddington. It was a very lowly job as a secretarial person taking minutes in meetings. And then I went back home to Stoke-on-Trent on the train. And when I got home, my dad said, well, they've both phoned and they've both offered you the jobs. And then evidently my mum and dad started telling the second one about the first job. So the guy from Paddington said to my mum and dad, "Oh, tell her not to go to Redbridge. That isn't London. She needs to come to Paddington and be with us." So I went to Paddington, and that was it, on the basis of that. And nothing else. So I could actually be a housing officer now, not a health worker. But so it was a complete accident, but then I was hooked. That job was very lonely. It was a complete gobbledygook to me at the beginning, that talking this NHS language that I didn't understand, that I tried to write down. But in time, I started to watch, because it was at that interface between the Department of Health and politicians and the health service. And I watched how politics influenced everything, and how a plan could get right to the last hurdle and then be scuppered by a politician. And that was really good learning for the future. So it was a brilliant first job, because you got an oversight of how the system worked.
Yeah, massive insights at that very early time in your career. So who has inspired you?
2 women, both GPs, both in Hackney. One called Dr. Gabby Tobias, who was the loveliest, softly spoken. She wasn't quiet, but she was gentle, eminently common sense approach, very patient focused. I remember ringing her one day, and she said, it was a weekend, and she said, "I'm just off to clean one of my patients' houses because it's stressing them out so much that their house isn't clean."
Thank you.
And I mean, like a GP like there is no GP anymore, but amazing. Always thinking about how things could be practically applied. And she inspired me because of all of that for 2 reasons: that she was utterly trusted by her GP colleagues. So, and that I think she was the first person who taught me about this: let everybody have their say, and then find the moment when you've got to get to the next phase of starting to decide. Because she would quite often let all of that play out, not necessarily chipping in that much, and then come in nearer the end with, "I'm hearing this and I'm hearing this, and I think that means that and that we should do this." And 9 times out of 10, she would get that summarised perfectly, and people would say, "Yeah, you're right, Gabby," and off we go. And she could calm a room. She could calm when everybody was getting agitated. She could calm. And then the second person is very different, but another Hackney GP, woman GP, Deborah Colvin, who was the chair of the GP Federation and whose idea the Federation was. So Deborah, for me, had that remarkable ability to think big picture, future-proof. So when she said, "We need a federation," federations weren't around at that moment. We need a thing that helps us all, because we are 43 little things all struggling, and we need something bigger than us, but it needs to be run by us, and we need to own it and guide it and be part of it. But she didn't know what she meant. And she got 43 practices to agree to that. Remarkable. Again, because of trust, because she was real. And she could also then switch immediately to patient X needs to be getting this, this, and this, and they're not getting it, and the service needs to change, and da-da-da. So she could go big sky down to very specific for this individual. And I think that's there aren't that many people who can do both of those things. But again, the common thing, I mean, Deborah's style was much more abrasive sometimes, stamping her feet and having a hissy fit, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. You have to choose your moment. But the thing they both had was the utter trust of the GP body. That, if Deborah said, "I've been thinking about this, and I think blah, blah, blah," people would go, "Yeah, you do our thinking for us." Remarkable women.
Absolutely. And I've had the privilege of meeting both of them, which has been great.
Yeah.
So could you tell us about the difficult decision that you had to make and how you navigated your way through, other than the A&E, obviously, at Mount Vernon, which maybe not was your decision?
So quite early on in my career. There was increasing evidence of a GP not really performing to the standard that they needed to. And the LMC were involved, the BMA were, everybody was putting in a lot of the supportive stuff to see if this person could get there. The truth was they really didn't have the insight that they were performing poorly. It wasn't really shifting anything in the person. They were an absolutely lovely person, and they were utterly, utterly adored by their patients, utterly, and their staff. And there came a point when I just had to, we had a sort of clinical governance committee in the PCT. We had to basically reach the point where it was like, no, we're going into a different mode now. And we need to, put this into the channels around performance and potentially removal from the register, which is what happened. And I felt bad for the person. I had to go to a hearing. Many of us did, and demonstrate our case, rightly so. And I felt really bad because I'd effectively, not on my own, but I'd made the decision that we destroyed that person's career and livelihood. But I had to, because they were dangerous. And Auntie Joan would have expected me to. Because, the people who were seeing that GP didn't know they were dangerous, but it had to be done. Interestingly, I bumped into the person in the street a few years later and they hugged me. But it was hard, but I knew it was right. So I had to do it. Now, you see, for me, that is what leaders have to do. Sometimes it's really, really hard, but you have to do it anyway because you are a leader. And there were people before me, many, many people before me, who had known exactly what that GP was doing, and they'd done nothing. I don't think that's what being a leader is about.
So what is it inside of you that caused you to know that this was something you had to do, no matter how difficult it was at the end of the day?
Because those patients were not getting the service that they should get, and that was, for some of those patients, going to be dangerous. This was a GP who did not, we had to do some role plays, and we did a classic role play of a possible heart attack. And he sent the actor home with some aspirin. Somebody had to do something about that. And if it wasn't me, the buck stopped with me. I was in charge of clinical governance. I get quite annoyed about all these things coming out about poor services in hospitals. People either too scared, or they don't know what to do, or they just are deluded, or they just don't want to rock the boat. That's not what leadership is about. If you have a poor service, it's up to you to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see your passion for the NHS and patient care still shining through. So what would you like to be remembered for? If there was one thing you could be remembered for, what would that be?
Improving general practice in primary care for the city and Hackney. I absolutely believe that if we lose it, and I think we might be at risk of losing it, our services will be the worst. It is a jewel. It is so important. That link to a registered list, locked into a local community, knowing there is somebody who's approachable, who can get you into services, theoretically, to whom you can tell things that other people you won't tell. And for people in deprived populations, primary care is accessible, non-judgmental primary care is so important. And I made it better. I got more people doing it. I got them doing it better. I got them better buildings. I got them more staff. I got them more money to pay more staff.
A brilliant legacy to leave on the whole system, really. So as we come to the end of our conversation, what's a key piece of advice you would like to give to somebody who's starting out on a career in the NHS?
Oh, love it. Embrace it, even when it drives you mad. It's important. It's valuable. So go for it. I would say don't confuse sitting in lots of committee meetings on Zoom where things get talked about and not a lot happens with real work. Yes, of course, every bureaucracy has some of that. But don't think that if you do that all day, you've done a day's work. So make the space to do the right thing at whatever level. Find the space and build the skills in yourself and think, whoever your Auntie Joan is, what would he or she say is the right thing as a patient, as a relative of a patient, and am I doing it, or what's stopping me doing it, and build your skill base to be able to do that.
Brilliant. Really good advice for somebody. So thank you, Laura, so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. I've loved it.
If you enjoyed this episode, then I'd really appreciate it if you could rate, review and subscribe. If you're keen to carry on this conversation, then you can find us at Ed for Health over on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you.